In 2010, a University of Toronto professor published a report about income in Toronto's neighborhoods. It contained a prediction. By 2025, the middle-income neighborhoods would essentially disappear. A city that was predominantly middle-class would be replaced by two cities, a wealthy one and a poor one, with almost nothing in between. We are now in 2026. This video is about whether he was right or wrong, and about the decisions made in specific rooms in specific years that determined the answer. David Hulchanski is a professor of community development at the University of Toronto. In simple terms, he has spent most of his career studying how cities work. His 2010 report, 3 Cities Within Toronto, is the foundational document for understanding the changes to the city over the past 50 years. Hulchanski and his team took census data going back to 1970 and plotted average individual incomes against the city's average. The result was a set of color-coded maps. The map from 1970 is almost entirely one color. Roughly 2/3 of Toronto's neighborhoods fell within 20% of the city's average income, being classified as middle income. But by 2005, that middle was cut in half. In its place, the research identifies 3 distinct cities. City 1 is a band of high-income neighborhoods that run mainly along the Yonge subway line through the old city of Toronto's core, like Forest Hill, Rosedale, Lawrence Park, and the Annex. City 2 is the shrinking middle, scattered pockets mostly in the older inner suburbs. And there is City 3, a belt of low-income neighborhoods that wraps around the northwest and northeast edges of the city, in areas like Jane and Finch, parts of Scarborough, and northwest Etobicoke. These are neighborhoods that were solidly middle income in 1970. By 2005, these neighborhoods had fallen 30% or more below the city's average income. To understand how Toronto got here, we need to go back a few decades. In 1970, Toronto was not a perfect city, but it was, in a meaningful sense, a broadly shared one. The post-war boom had built out the inner suburbs as working and middle-class communities. Factories employed people at union wages. The federal government was actively investing in affordable housing, and Toronto, like most Canadian cities, had a functioning mixed-income neighborhood model. The clearest proof of that model is about a 15-minute walk east of City Hall. The St. Lawrence neighborhood was built in the late 1970s on the land the city owned. The plan, developed under Mayor David Crombie and planner Michael Dennis, was designed to be mixed income from the start. Market condos next to non-profit housing next to co-ops, all on the same block. There were no towers in the park, no concentrated poverty, and no separation between who could afford what. It won international awards and is still considered one of the most successful examples of urban mixed income development in North America. And it was heavily supported by federal funding alongside city leadership. But these ideal conditions would not last for too much longer. During the 1990s, 3 key factors helped define where we are today. In 1993, Canada was in the middle of a brutal recession. The federal deficit was mounting, and the recently elected government came to power on a mandate of fiscal discipline, planning large cuts fast. One of the areas targeted was the federal social housing program. On January 1st, 1994, the federal government cancelled all new fundings for nonprofit and cooperative housing across Canada. For 40 years, the federal government had been a partner in housing. It had built the St. Lawrence neighborhood. It had co-founded Regent Park. It had seeded hundreds of co-ops and nonprofits across the country. But from 1994 onwards, that support was gone. Now, provinces were responsible for their social housing projects. Then, another change. In the late 1990s, the province transferred responsibility for social housing to Ontario's municipalities. They framed this as efficiency. Let local governments handle local problems. The city of Toronto inherited a stock of aging social housing towers with extensive deferred maintenance backlogs. According to the TCHC, as of 2024, the backlog of capital repairs is around $1.75 billion. In 1995, the provincial government cut social assistance rates in Ontario by 21%, reducing monthly income to levels far below average rent. And the impacts of the federal and provincial withdrawals started to be felt. When federal money was building co-ops and non-profit housing, it kept a good share of the rental stock permanently below market rate. When that stopped, and when provincial downloading left the city responsible for maintaining the social housing structure, the affordable stock shrank and deteriorated. In the early 1990s, the federal government made changes to the Income Tax Act that allowed for the creation of real estate investment trusts, or REITs. In simple terms, a REIT is a corporation that holds income-producing real estate and distributes the earnings to shareholders. By the late 1990s, Canada's first major REITs were operating, with Toronto as the primary market. Over the following decade, institutional investors like pension funds, private equity firms, publicly traded REITs began acquiring Toronto's aging private rental stock. The apartment towers built in the 1960s and 70s, the ones that had housed working-class tenants at below-market rents, became financial instruments. The logic of a financial instrument is different from the logic of a landlord. A landlord might leave rent at a level the market supports because turnover is costly and long-term tenants are stable. A financial instrument exists to maximize the returns to shareholders. The incentive is to raise rents to market rate as quickly as the law allows, and to renovate units aggressively to justify those increases. At the same time, the condominium market took off. Condos were built at a scale Toronto had never seen before. On paper, this might look like a housing boom, but most of these units weren't being built as long-term rental housing. They were being built as individual assets, bought by owners and by investors. Many of those investors do rent their units out. In fact, condos have quietly become a major part of Toronto's rental market, but they don't function like the purpose-built rental housing the city used to produce. Rents are higher, tenure is less stable, and each unit is tied to the financial logic of an individual owner, not a system designed to provide long-term, affordable housing. Over time, the result was a shift. Housing became more of a valuable investment asset rather than a place to live. So what we're left with by the mid-2000s is this. The federal government had been out of affordable housing for over a decade. The province has downloaded its obligation to a city that can't meet them. The city's aging rental stock has been absorbed into institutional portfolios where the incentive is rent maximization, and new supply is almost entirely condominium. So let's go back to Hulchanski's prediction. If the trends they had measured between 1970 and 2005 continued at the same rate, what would Toronto look like in 2025? Remember, in 1970, roughly 2/3 of Toronto's neighborhoods were middle income. By 2005, that had fallen to about 40%. Hulchanski's prediction for 2025? 9%. The middle income neighborhoods, for all practical purposes, were basically gone, replaced by a city that was 30% wealthy and 60% low income. But we are now in 2026, so what do we actually know? Well, we know enough to say the direction was right. As of the time of this video, a formal update that provides a direct comparison against the 2025 projection using the same methodology has not been published yet. But we are not without data, and what the data shows is not reassuring. A 2017 report by Hulchanski's team in collaboration with the United Way analyzed 2015 income data and found out that the very low income neighborhoods in Toronto grew from 5 in 1980 to 88 in 2015. That is almost a 17 times increase in just 35 years. The 2021 census adds further texture. The median household income in Toronto in 2020 was $74,000. However, the neighborhoods on the top of the list have median household incomes 2 times or more higher than the lowest income neighborhoods. Another peer-reviewed study published in 2021 in PLOS1 examined income polarization across all 8 of Canada's largest cities from 1971 to 2016. The study found significant and consistent decreasing trends in the middle-income population with simultaneously increasing trends in low-income groups. And Toronto, by every measure in that study, showed the strongest trends of any Canadian city. Other metrics reinforced these findings. In 2022, 25% of Toronto's children lived below the poverty line. 1 in 4 children. In some postal codes in the northwest of the city, child poverty rates exceeded 40%. A study by the local and St. Michael's Hospital from 2024 observed that the life expectancy in Toronto's wealthiest neighborhoods is up to 12 years longer than in its poorest. So whether at 9% or somewhat higher, the middle-class neighborhoods that defined Toronto in the 1970s, the place where a person on a working wage could afford to live stably, raise a family, and expect their community to hold together, is almost extinct. By every available measure, it is smaller, more precarious, and harder to sustain than at any point in the city's modern history. Let's go back to St. Lawrence for a moment. This neighborhood was built on a principle that a city can choose to integrate income levels by design, that public land can be used to create communities that are stable, mixed, and permanent, that housing can be a service like roads or sewers rather than exclusively a commodity. But it required political will, government support, and sustained investment over several years. And 50 years later, it still works. St. Lawrence is widely considered one of the most successful mixed-income neighborhoods in North America. The Three Cities report was published in 2010. In the years since, housing costs have risen dramatically. Governments have partially re-entered the housing space. New policies have been introduced, new plans announced. But City 1 continues to grow wealthier, and City 3 continues to expand. The middle, the part of the city that once held everything together, remains under pressure. The disappearance of middle-class neighborhoods is not the natural state of a city. It's the result of decisions. Decisions that accumulate slowly, over time, until they reshape the geography itself. The question the research leaves us with is, will Toronto build its way towards equity again? When Hulchanski made his prediction, he hoped he was wrong. He said that none of this was inevitable, that with political will, investment in housing and in infrastructure, the trend could be reversed. But 16 years later, the fate of the middle-income neighborhoods seems inevitable. If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Stay tuned for more!